There are so many ways in which our work already overlaps. Some of our expertise overlaps a lot, but there are lots of ways that we can support one another's work. So I think it's been hopefully clear from what Will and I have just been talking about, that the IUCN can play a really important role in helping to guide priority setting. But I think collectively we can really do a much better job if we work together for understanding the conservation needs, planning conservation action in a prioritised and strategic way at a global level. And I think sea life is so uniquely placed among the zoo and aquarium world because you are represented globally. You have staff globally, you have venues and collections globally. For us to work alongside you, I think would be incredibly exciting, especially at that planning level and at action. So really looking at coordinated strategic conservation action that utilises the skills that we have in our different communities to the best advantage. So it looks at the fact that the IUCN is largely a scientific organisation and isn't great at communicating and engaging the public, but Sea Life is. And that we have these global networks and global credibility as well that allows us to have a seat at the table at decision-making policy setting events, whereas Sea Life may not have that. And we can kind of leverage our strengths in the ways that's going to lead to the best species conservation outcomes. But also really recognising the important role that education and community behaviour change plays in saving species. We talk a lot about conservation being fieldwork or action on the ground, but if we're not addressing the social threats like illegal wildlife trade, like shark finning, like like overfishing generally, if we're not addressing these social threats and trying to engage the community alongside us, then the tangible conservation action we're doing on the ground is really just plugging one leaky hole in a very leaky boat. So we really do need to be looking at all four of these as collective efforts towards conservation. And I think I'm really excited to see the work that Sea Life is doing on so many of these fronts already, but I would love for us to see how we can work together more. So I think I see the biggest opportunities for us to work together at the moment is for just using IUCN information more for priority setting, and this needs to happen on both sides. Will just mentioned that at the moment the red list is being used by a number of taxonomic advisory groups across aquariums in Europe especially to advise on collection planning. And really, the red list has a long way to go before it can effectively do that to the best of its ability. I mean, we'll just mention that there are holes in the assessments, but also really having the expertise from the ex situ community within the IUCN to advise on which species are best placed for captive breeding. Not every species that's critically endangered is suited to a captive breeding program. And so having the shared expertise to know when it is appropriate to bring species into collections and when and how species are best going to breed. And that is the expertise that sits within your community, not ours. And so really sharing that knowledge. But then also prioritising field investment as well. So looking at, like Will said, those key biodiversity areas, marine protected zones, and where the highest density of critically endangered or endangered species are. Joining us in red listing and planning so that we can get to that point, so that we can start filling those knowledge gaps and understanding more what the picture is at a global level before we can take effective conservation action at a holistic level. But also linking with our specialist groups. Again, Andy mentioned this morning that there are some very clear focuses for the Sea Life Trust, and I'm sure that there are within your individual sites as well, where there are particular taxonomic or thematic focuses within your sites or globally, linking with the relevant specialist groups so that we're not duplicating effort, so that we can more easily share our skill sets and understand who's best placed to do what, and just support one another's work in the ways that we're talking about. And just additionally, you can also become an IUCN member. We're seeing an increasing number of animal welfare groups actually applying to become IUCN members. We've got a couple of applications in at the moment, and I spoke at the World Association for Zoo and Aquarium conference last month, and we talked about the challenges of having louder animal rights groups on the IUCN and having those voices on the global policy setting stage and not having enough voices from the zoo and aquarium community having voting rights within IUCN. We, again, do have quite a loud voice on the policy stage, and so it's important that zoos and aquariums are represented there. And Sea Life is such a big constituent of that community that it would be great to have you represented. But to talk very quickly about our marine efforts, I just want to introduce the Global Marine Species Assessment work, and it's similar to the work that Will was just talking about in freshwater, but really historically, marine aquatic species generally have been really absent from the red list. Mammals, there's a lot more people out there studying mammals generally, and they're a lot easier to find. You can go out there and shine a torch and see a lot of the mammals that are on our red list. But marine species have been really underrepresented. So back in 2005, an initiative was started by the IUCN Species Survival Commission and the Global Species Program that Will talked about, and Conservation International, to really try and ramp up the representation on the red list for marine species, and to give us a better understanding of what threats were being faced by in the oceans around the world, and where the critical areas and species are for us to focus our efforts on. So the target was set that we needed to assess 20,000 additional species between 2005 and 2020. We're well on the way to hitting 2020 as a year date, but we're also getting there as well in terms of the number of assessments that have been undertaken. The priority species for this effort was to ensure that every marine vertebrate, including sea snakes and all of the vertebrate fishes, had been assessed, but to also have included representative samples of habitat-forming primary producers, reef-building corals, and a representative sample of invertebrates as well. It's not possible for us to assess all of the marine invertebrates on the planet, but to get a representative sample of them on the red list. So since 2005, there's been 61 regional workshops that have taken place, including 550 participants that have come from over 410 institutions and 80 countries. So there's been a huge representation from the global network of expertise on trying to get more marine species on the map, but there's also a lot of work still to do. So you can see that back in 2006, there was fewer than 2,000 marine species on the red list. It's now over 14,000. So we're kind of more than halfway towards our target, but there's still a long way to go. The only difference in the blue and red line on this map is that, on this graph, is that there's a little bit of a time lag from when the assessments are done to when they're published on the red list, because like any scientific paper, they are reviewed before they then get published, and so they go through quite a stringent review process. But in 2006, only 2.5% of the species included on the red list were marine. Now that's up to 13%, so we really are increasing their representation. Unsurprisingly, exploitation is by far and away the biggest threat to marine species. Pollution is up there as well, but exploitation is by far and away the biggest. And there is quite dramatic loss as well, particularly in habitat specialists and species with restricted ranges, which is fairly universal across the board with species loss. But we're also seeing really quite distressing loss in a lot of the critical habitat. So reef-building corals, which we talked about before, but also seagrasses, which is really relevant to the project we heard about earlier this morning, and mangroves. And if we lose these key habitat building species, then we're going to see ramifications the whole way along the food web. Now, these assessments don't just happen at a species level. We do run regional assessments as well, which I think is really relevant, and this is the way that the freshwater unit works as well. This is really relevant to sea life because you have regional centres around the world. We'd love to work with you more on these regional assessment workshops, where we bring in the expertise from that region and do a collection of species and taxa all at once. And the other benefit of that is not just that the expertise is from that area, it's easier and cheaper to get everyone together to do the assessments, but you also bring in a lot of non-charismatic taxa and species at the same time. So you can do assessments for the invertebrates as well as for the coral reef fish at the same time, or the sharks, and do them all at once with the expertise in the room, which means that we can have a far more comprehensive assessment of the picture of that regional centre, rather than trying to do all of the sharks and then all of the invertebrates, because the invertebrates tend to get left behind. And we'd love to see you be more involved in this. As I said, it would be fantastic, and as Will mentioned as well, to have your staff more involved in red listing, to run these workshops at Sea Life centres. Whether we find funding externally or through you guys, but just running the workshops at your centres to give your staff a chance to be involved, to then get trained and be involved in red listing in an ongoing way, but also to bring these experts into your Sea Life centres, and they can do additional talks, engage your staff more in the work that they're doing around the world, but also hear from you about the work that you're doing and the way that your knowledge can contribute back to the conservation action planning for some of these species as well. I won't go back into that because Will and I both already mentioned it, but also in an ongoing way, beyond red listing, moving into this action planning, really looking at the opportunities to partner with specialist groups. And just to give the shark specialist group as an example, because it's been a bit of a theme for the afternoon, our shark specialist group are really active. They've comprehensively assessed most of the shark species, although there are new species being described and they've still got work to do. But they're looking to continuously reassess those species as well, so we can track it over time, because we are seeing dramatic losses in shark species around the world. But as I mentioned before, they're working with a number of key NGO players around the world right now to develop a holistic global conservation action plan on sharks. They would love to work with you specifically, actually. They've requested to reach out to Sea Life to work together on an aquarium conservation strategy for sharks, to really look at what species are the most appropriate for captive breeding within aquariums, where are the highest priorities to try and galvanise aquarium support, and what issues can we really reach out to the public and galvanise action with your 23 million visitors around the world. And so we would love to talk more about having an interconnection between the Shark Specialist Group and the Sea Life teams around the world. And we really see that there is really complementary expertise. You guys, among many other things, you have really great expertise in population management, captive breeding, husbandry and veterinary expertise, which we really have none of that represented in a lot of these groups. You have a huge staff base with potential to really engage and help support us in the work that we're doing, mostly on a voluntary capacity. Centres all around the world and 24 million visitors. At the same time, we have a really strong, globally credible brand. We have 15,000 experts across the IUCN. We have really strong expertise in wild population viability, threat assessments, and policy influence, and then those shared expertise in the middle of both being globally focused, conservation oriented, and sharing diverse expertise in research. Now, I am out of time, but I'll just, if I can have kind of 2 more minutes. This is an example from the zoo world, but a really effective partnership where Bristol Zoo became the host of the Primate Specialist Group. They provided a program officer to become to give administrative but also advice on the zoo community support into this group, and that paid time support from their staff member meant that this group could really move forward. They finished all of the red listing of lemur species. They then pulled together experts from around the world for an action planning process, and they've now just received, well, they're in the process of receiving $7 million worth of funding through the Save Our Species Grant Fund through IUCN, and this work is really going to turn around the declines in lemur species on Madagascar, almost entirely because this partnership has pulled together the right players, the right momentum, and the right amount of funding from different players around the world. There are multiple examples, and I won't go into these ones, except that I am also about to sign a partnership within the next week with an aquarium within Europe that is going to put on a full-time marine red listing officer to help with the global marine assessment. They're going to be based in the aquarium. They're going to be working with our team in the Marine Biodiversity Unit over in Virginia, but they'll be based in the UK. Working with our marine unit to try and get through these marine red listing, particularly focusing on species that are largely held in aquariums, so we can try and turn around that lack of data that we've got. And my very last slide, there are so many benefits for us working together on both sides, and my work really is about looking for mutual benefit opportunities that we can feel on both sides. So really looking at getting greater recognition and credibility for the work of Sea Life as well as the IUCN specialist groups, achieving both of our conservation missions, which are huge and almost impossible, I would wager, to do on our own, sharing our skill sets and getting the job done with the skills that are most needed for that particular species and point in time. But also, there's been a bit of mention this morning about risk management and public perceptions of aquariums. We have, again, I know I've said it quite a few times, but we have 10,000 of the world's leading conservation scientists in our network alone. My objective is to have those 10,000 members all seeing aquariums and zoos as critical for the future of species conservation on the planet, and to have a very loud voice in saying that. And not only to the public, but also to legislative processes, things that make it hard for you to transact your animals, particularly intercontinentally, to stand up and say, no, this animal movement is part of a conservation action plan. We endorse it, and we want it to. It's critical to help secure the future of this species. And so giving you that support at a PR and legislative level, I think, is really important to the future of aquariums. And also accessing new and improved areas of revenue as well, and giving stronger credibility to fundraising efforts, but also opening up grant opportunities that wouldn't exist in isolation to the IUCN or to Sea Life necessarily, but when we apply for grants in unison. We've seen this with the lemur example with Bristol Zoo. They've seen a 15% increase in their success of grant applications since they joined and applied for grants as part of the partnership rather than in isolation. So there's lots of opportunities to work together and for lots of great outcomes. We don't have time for questions because we've all gone over time this afternoon, but these are my details.